We had bits and pieces. Do you want to go through it again or no? We can go right to questions if you want.
I'll be super quick then. Briefly, I'm a climate scientist. I work in tropical Pacific climate using corals and caves to try to understand past climate variations, what's different about today, and what we might expect tomorrow. And I'm also working on climate solutions, both from a research perspective, with a set of sea level sensors on the coast here in Georgia. Love talking about that project, Internet of Things based, as well as some kind of larger scale carbon reduction strategies. So students and research based.
Well, students' first question, that as instructors to help us kind of keep things in order, how do you research corals, what to use to study it, and how often are you in the ocean kind of hands-on with corals?
Oh, very, very little compared to what I'd like. So I probably go out, depending on the year. Sometimes we're out on 2 or 3 expeditions a year, and each expedition is about 2 weeks. But mostly we're back here in the lab working on our rock samples in my lab here at Georgia Tech. So the vast majority of the time is spent here at Georgia Tech. In my lab, I have a variety of large instruments that help analyze the chemical composition of the rocks, which is what is related to climate change and the temperature signals that are locked in the rocks. So that's, does that answer your question?
Let's see. I was looking at Storm 822. That answer our question? Okay, no one's saying no, so I'm going to assume that that was good. And Fuller 527. Fuller 527. Does that help what you were looking for? All right. You want to go with 3? Or if you see another one.
All right. Another question sent in by a student. What are the effects of coral reef destruction? Let you interpret that as you need to there.
Yeah. So corals are under just profound threat from a number of different angles today. And we can think about long-standing challenges associated with overfishing, dredging of reefs, sedimentation from agricultural practices, dynamite fishing, coastal development that can harm the reef. I mean, this list just goes on and on in terms of what we consider local impact of humans on reefs. And these are the kinds of impacts that have driven the Caribbean to virtually a shadow of its former glory over the last 50 years. And these are the kinds of impacts that the Australians have to consider when they think about managing the Great Barrier Reef. For generations to come. And so those are things you can kind of control. The threat you can't control very well right now is that global warming is reaching a level that is directly impacting reefs around the globe. And that pushes them into really acute stress. And during 2016, many reefs died as a result of prolonged, really hot ocean temperatures associated with greenhouse gases and climate change and global warming. And so that's not something you can really control because it's very large scale. You can't just cool a reef down. There's no such thing as doing that. And so the challenges in 2016 were, I think it was 70% of the global reefs were thermally stressed and basically went into a bleaching mode where they lose their colors and they lose their algae photosymbionts and they kind of pale and dormant for a number of months. And a smaller fraction, something like 20 to 30% of the reefs in 2016 died as a result of temperature stress because it didn't cool back down fast enough for these corals to regain their normal function. And so as somebody who studies reefs, who's studied reefs for the last 20 years now as a scientist, it's a really grim wake-up call that this is going down so early. It's not something that we anticipated would happen maybe for another couple decades. And here we are talking about global coral bleaching, global coral mortality events in 2016. The Great Barrier Reef bleached in 2016, it bleached in 2017, and many sites in the Pacific are under bleaching threat today. And so this is just an indication that this is not something that we need to wait a decade for. These are things that are going to be happening today. And this just is part of a larger package, of course, when we think about climate impacts that extend not just the coral reefs in the middle of nowhere, but also on our doorsteps here in America with hurricanes, wildfires, heat waves, sea level rise that are bringing this pain home to our doorsteps today.
So one of the questions that popped into my head, I don't know if you guys thought of this, but what's the difference? How do you tell the difference between when a coral is just bleached and when it dies?
Oh, super easy. So when the coral is bleached, it looks like somebody just took a picture of that coral and made it black and white, except on the white side. So it's just like a complete loss of color. It is pure white. And when it dies, the coral tissue basically is overrun immediately by these red-brown algae that cover it in a matter of weeks and colonize the entire structure. And so they're this kind of filamentous red-brown algae that are wafting in the currents. And so when you dive on a reef that's been newly dead, that's what you see. That's what we saw when we dove on the dead reefs in 2016. Just a really eerie sight. It's kind of all the structures there, but it's like this blanket carpet fuzz over everything, the same color. And now we're going through other phases of coral reef recovery, where we're trying to, the fish are eating down that algae, and we're trying to recover, tiny, tiny baby corals on the reef. But there's no such thing as a coral coming back from the dead. And so all of that material, 90% of the corals at my research site of 20 years died in 2016. And so it's going to take decades to recover those corals in the future. But of course, the next warming event is not going to be decades in the future. It's going to be over the next years. And so that's really the reality with corals and climate change.
Okay. Sorry, a question that a student came up with here just a second ago involves corals adapting. Is there any signs of any particular species or anything that are adapting to this?
That is a great question, and the answer is yes. And so that's some interesting silver lining in the science of climate change and coral reefs. So when you look at a big picture, it's pretty grim, and we're losing a lot of corals due to temperature stress right now. But when we were diving on our reef on Christmas Island, this very small remote island in the middle of the Pacific, even in the midst of the death and destruction of 2016, there were less than 5% of the corals that looked perfect. They were bleached, and they certainly weren't dead. It's like they didn't get the memo or something. And so they're basically the examples of basically thermal resistance, of resilience in the face of these acutely warm ocean temperatures. And so what we do as scientists, of course, we take photos, we take video transects. They were all very small. They were not the largest. They were probably only 5 years and under, the smallest cohort of one species. Those are the only ones that survived the stress at my research site. But what we did, so we photograph them, we characterize them, we measure them, and then we take a very small tissue sample. It's kind of harsh because they survived, and now you're taking a piece of their tissue sample. But it is for science. We take a very small quarter-size sample of the coral, and we send that off for genomic analysis. And so then what we're doing with that is we're trying to understand that if there are any genetic origins to the thermal resistance in these corals, obviously that would have implications for maybe being able to intervene and breed supercorals and seed reefs with more resistant sets of corals than you would otherwise get to do if you just, didn't try to understand this. So that's a really good example of how science can try to inform solutions. Even when the situation with reefs looks very, very grim, there are hundreds of scientists around the world literally racing to try to find the secrets to resilience so that we might be able to help corals over this hump of the next 50 years.
Other questions based off of that one? Okay. Let's see. So, the next question I think you might have touched on a little bit, but what is the average climate change over the years that you personally have noticed?
So I've been working at 20 years at this research site. Obviously, most of our climate records go back 100 years or more. And so that's what most scientists, including myself, use to look at the impact of humans on global temperatures. But even over the space of time that I've worked at Christmas Island, temperatures have gotten noticeably warmer by like maybe only several tenths of a degree. But the last El Nino event, which is the temperature extreme that killed the corals at my research site, was significantly warmer than the previous one, which was in 1998. And that difference was enough to kill the corals in 2016 and not in 1998. And so even over a relatively short time, you can start to see some of these impacts creeping into these environments that are otherwise perfectly pristine reefs. So to be able to see that in my own lifetime is really sobering. But it's not the only example of a climate impact that we're seeing in our lifetimes today. Down on coastal Georgia, where I work on sea level rise, whole communities are having to wake up to the fact that high tides aren't what they used to be. They are much worse. And so they're causing flooding along Savannah and other coastal Georgia communities where that didn't used to be the case 20 years ago. And so it's not the case that climate change is some kind of 2050 thing that nobody has to worry about. It's very much a current threat that's bringing down these impacts in many different ways across our world. And we have some options about what to do with that, but obviously we have to act now, and we need to involve everybody.
All right, thank you for that. All right, the next question. How long do we have until this becomes a problem that we can't do anything about? So the point of no return, what are you calculating for that?
There is no point of no return. Okay. So I'm sure humans will survive climate change. I know that corals will survive climate change. Let's speak about one of the most vulnerable ecosystems of climate change, which is corals, and then we can think about what that means for us. So for corals, they've been on this planet for 260 million years, okay, in their current form. And if you think that a meteorite that killed the dinosaurs and didn't kill the corals, that's a pretty serious hit that they survived, right? And so as a geologist, I have the benefit of placing the current stress that they're going through in a broad context and recognizing that there will be corals millions of years from now. The questions are, what's going to Hawaii, to Florida, to the Great Barrier Reef in the next couple decades, and do we want to do anything to fix that? But corals will be here in the long term. And so if we want to think about climate change, it's not like an on-off switch. It's not a pass-fail class. So you basically get a grade on your performance, where if you get an A, that means that you're taking it seriously enough to try to minimize the damages that your generation is going to be facing. If you want to get an F, that means that you're happy to just let it rip and pass the bill onto your generation and make you guys have to jump through quite a number of higher risk scenarios that are avoidable today. So for every year that we delay, we bake in more risk. And for every action that we take, literally every action that we take today is reaping benefits. Not in 2050 or 2100, but now and going forward. So let me layer up two more points there, then I'll take another question. But what do I mean by acting on climate? So one thing that we have to do is prepare our communities for current and future climate change, right? We already talked about how many of these impacts are already here. So we owe it to ourselves, frankly, to begin to understand how to protect communities from climate impacts today, including sea level rise, wildfires, hurricanes, heat waves, and extreme precipitation events like the one that are challenging Midwestern communities right now. Second thing we need to do in terms of acting on climate is, of course, reducing our emissions and find ways to get CO2 out of the sky, suck it out of the sky. Thankfully, we have a wonderful R&D project that nature has been working on for millions of years. It's called a tree. And it's something that we can turn to pull CO2 out of the sky while we reduce emissions. And by ourselves, obviously a tree doesn't live for 1,000 years. But what we really need right now are solutions that are going to be impactful over a 30 to 50-year time frame. That's when we have to solve this. And that's your guys' watch. I hope you're listening carefully, because we need you guys. You need us, and we need you.
All right. The next one, or you want-
Well, wasn't there one about smaller plants? That would be a
Yes,
good one to
okay.
know.
So this next question, we know how well trees work. Are there any smaller plant alternatives or anything that you've encountered that work just as well as a large tree?
Well, it's really,
You need to ask it louder.
Oh,
so they
sorry.
can-
Let me
the
ask them
question-
quicker.
The question that was on the floor was, besides trees, are there smaller plants that may work just as well as trees?
All right, now you're
that's a
good.
really good question. So it depends what you want, because there are a lot of photosynthetic things on our planet. Now, the kinds we would like to turn to are the kinds of things that we can make use of, right? So, yeah, actually, if we could have photosynthesis suck CO2 into the deep earth, that would be great. But guess what? Photosynthesis on the surface of the earth. And there's a long way between the surface of the earth and deep sequestration of carbon. So what can we do to get around that? We can do a couple different things. One of the things that the IPCC talks about, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I am a part of, talks about is using photosynthetic products, plant products for fuels, right? We have a problem that we have a reliance on fossil fuels for transportation right now, right? We have very little avenues away from that, very strong dependence. And so solar panels not going to help you with that. You can't fly a plane on solar panels, at least not yet. So we would be great if we could find a way to create what we call biofuels from photosynthetic materials. Most people are turning to algae-based biofuels, which they grow very quickly. You can engineer them to have a very high lipid content, which is that energy-rich portion of the algae itself, and extract that and refine it and basically use it to power transportation. So Virgin Airlines has a plane that they developed to as a pilot to fly on algae biofuels. I would not be at all surprised if we don't end up putting algae biofuels in our cars in the next several years. We all know about corn ethanol has been in use in this country for decades, right? You can drive up to a pump and there's a sign on it that says, this gas contains 10% ethanol, right? And that's corn-based ethanol grown out of corn in the Midwest and refined for fuel use. If we want to think about another end use, though, I think the building sector could be incorporating wood products. And that sequesters for quite a long time. Obviously, the built environment can be decades and sequester that carbon dioxide for decades. And so those are the kinds of things we think about. The last case I'll talk about with respect to biological carbon sequestration and usable end products, where we think about harnessing wood, although there are other sources of fuel, to power plants. And then you might say, well, that's just sucking CO2 out of the sky to burn it, put it back up. If you combine that power plant with carbon capture and storage underground, which we can do, it's expensive and we still have a lot of technical development to do, but that is not so far off. Then you're using a tree to suck it out of the sky, you're burning the content in that fuel for electricity, and then through a point source, you can develop sequestration system to get it back underground and store it for perhaps centuries. So there are a variety of ways to use photosynthesis to our advantage, to try to think about turning photosynthetic plants to use byproducts that will fuel a low carbon economy.
All right, questions for Dr. Cobb based off that one? Okay. So the next question we have, ooh, this one's kind of long. Okay. So one of the questions that our students have asked is, what can we do? You know, we're here in Nebraska. We're not anywhere near a coast. How do we make it more clear to the larger population that global warming, rise in sea levels, ice melting is a serious, real problem? What do we do?
Yeah. So I get this question a lot, as you might imagine. And one of the most important things that you guys can do is to talk about climate change. And this is your problem, because this is going to land at your feet, right? All those people in power right now are probably going to be dead in 20 years. And you guys are going to be going to your jobs and raising kids and trying to make ends meet in an environment where you're going to be much more profoundly challenged by climate impacts. And it's not just a coastal issue. The recent National Climate Assessment, I point you to that, write that down. The National Climate Assessment just came out in November 2018. It's brand new. It contains all fresh information from the latest science. And it really clearly shows, for example, that much of the Midwest is going to be challenged profoundly with its economy that's based largely on agriculture. And agriculture is one of those sectors that is going to be heavily impacted by climate change. Why? First of all, it's going to get really hot, and that's not good for crops. Second of all, the precipitation that is going to come is going to be more irregular. There's going to be longer droughts and more concentrated precipitation events. And so when you think about, you know, the economy of a place like Nebraska, you have to think about the ways in which climate change impacts that economic environment when you're talking to adults and policymakers and they're just interested in you know, feeding their families, getting their paychecks, and not being taxed. You really have to talk about climate change in the way that it touches your state and your lives, and how it makes you feel that policymakers right now can't bring themselves to have, in some cases, a reasoned and scientifically grounded conversation about climate change. Tell your parents how that makes you feel. Tell your principal how that makes you feel. And then ask yourself what you can do in your own environments to begin to be part of the solution. So thinking about it is one thing. Making different choices as an individual is also extremely impactful. Humans are profoundly social creatures. We look to each other for cues about what's right and what's wrong and how to make sense of the world. And so using yourself as an example, I think is extremely important. It's also rewarding because you get to feel part of the solution and not part of the problem every day. So I do bike to work every day. After 15 years of getting in my car every day, I bike to work. I just bought solar panels this year after 20 years as a climate scientist. So, you know, these things, you don't have to wake up and say, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed with stuff I need to do. But taking some steps to try to help yourself be part of the solution is important. You're sitting in a building right now that can be a huge part of the solution as well. You could think about ways that you guys could help the school save energy, right? Help your school think about what it wants to do with respect to waste, right? All kinds of ways that institutions like schools can get engaged to be part of the solution.
All right, questions based off of that one?
The next one is relevant
Some,
anymore.
yeah, some of them
Sorry,
change.
give us just a sec here.
Well, then there's-
No problem.
Oh my gosh, okay.
Oh, hey, questions.
Hands, look at that.
Automatic hand dryers or paper towels?
That's a tough one. So some of these are tough calls. It depends on what hand dryer and it depends on what paper towel. Some paper towels are recycled, but that's very carbon intensive. Some hand dryers are better than others. If you have like one that's 60 years old, maybe it's not so great. If you have one that's more recent, it's probably more efficient. So in general, I would say that hand dryers are probably better because of the paper creation cycle is extremely energy intensive and water intensive. And then there's transporting those huge rolls around, right, in big trucks. So in general, I would say hand dryers.
All right, Luca.
Do you think the world's doing it? Like, do you think like the countries are really, or do you think we're already? Is it already we've caused ourselves so much like factories or anything creating all this and we can't come back from this?
Okay, I don't know if you could hear him. Do you think we're doing enough? Do you think was it factories or countries, Luca?
Well, I guess both. Because we're already so the industry and stuff built.
Okay, so his concern is about overall the industry piece of it, countries in general. Are we doing enough?
No. I mean, not even close. It's like dereliction of duty of historic proportions. And yet, I think that without a economic signal that can help us understand how costly carbon emissions are to our economy, to our future, to our livelihoods, we won't be able to make the change fast enough. So no amount of goodwill is going to fix this. We really need to have a price on carbon. And so there's legislation pending in the House right now, actually, for the first time in many, many years. And it's quite simple. It wants to put a price on carbon intensive sources of energy at the point of sale. So that would basically mean, and then where does that tax go? It would all go to DC into a vault that the government can't touch. It accumulates over the year. And at the end of the year, they open the vault, they count the number of Americans, they cut a check to each one of us as tax-paying individuals, and they divide that pot into by the number of Americans. Okay, so at the end of the year, there's no more money left in the vault because Americans has been distributed equally to every American. That's what's called. Here's a buzzword for you. It's called a revenue neutral carbon fee. Revenue neutral because we can't really call it a tax because the government doesn't ever get it. The people get it, right? But it is a carbon fee because it's a charge that you pay at the gas pump, at your electricity bill if it's coal-fired, at your natural gas bill for heating your home. That's your source of heat. And the fee that they're proposing is very modest, but by the end of the year, people who are making the right choices, companies, manufacturers that are making the right choices about carbon will be reaping economic benefit. Those that delay action in moving their processes and their bottom lines to a lower carbon model will be paying the rest of us for doing the right thing, right? So it's a redistribution from carbon intensive practices to low carbon practices choices, right? And the government just gets to collect money in the interim. The government holds it in an interim basis. So people like me who buy cheaper and just bought solar panels will be getting a net check at the end of the year. I'll be basically getting paid for those choices, right? And if you want to fly to Jamaica every month, and you want to own 5 mansions and 2 Hummers, you're going to be paying for the low carbon choices of those of us who don't choose to live that way. Does that make sense? So to answer the young man's question, we aren't moving fast enough. There are clear economic knobs that are being discussed in DC right now, like the one I just mentioned. That's the one I think is best. Because it's pretty simple, actually. I just explained it to y'all in 2 or 3 minutes. So if you want to know about how we can really get going, that's what we need to do. And this bill has bipartisan support. It's not just fun, crazy Democrats. There are quite a few moderate Republicans who support this bill because they understand how their districts are being impacted by climate change, and they want to do something about it.
Ryan?
What area of the world is being like affected by the coral bleaching? Like specifically what area?
His question is, what area is being the most impacted by coral bleaching?
It's a good question. It changes every year, depending on the patterns of ocean circulation for that year. So in 2016, my research site found itself at the bullseye of ocean temperature stress. Very unfortunate. That's why the losses there was so crippling. But this year, my research site is doing okay, and other sites around the West Pacific are in the bullseye of ocean warming. So you kind of have to think of the ocean not as a static, bowl of soup, but currents are always moving around, winds are always blowing in different ways, and so that those hot spots move around. But eventually, over a decade, every has its day, if you will, in the limelight of acute ocean temperature stress, and that's the threat.
Roger?
What country is doing the best of preventing coral bleaching? Which one's doing the worst?
Yeah, so I heard that. So I think that's a tough question, because what that comes down to is which country is doing best at trying to reduce the rates of climate change, because the temperature is linked to climate change, right? That's the temperature stress. So as much as Australia wants to do something to protect the Great Barrier Reef from climate change, all it could do is strengthen its policy around emissions reduction, right? That's what acting to protect its reef means. Now, Australia is run by a government that is really gun about coal, natural gas, and really has not rose to the occasion of meeting their commitments, international agreements about keeping climate change to under 2 degrees Celsius. So that would be a bad example of a country that has so much to lose, so much of economy tied to the Great Barrier Reef. It's like in a blah, 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 blah moment. That's very unfortunate. Countries like the UK are a shining example of what's possible. They have some of the deepest emissions reductions over the last 20 years of any country in the world. And that goes to show you that your economy doesn't need to suffer when you do enact such deep emissions reductions. I think they're down to 40% below 1990 levels, with a whole host of programs and efforts that they have led. So it's possible. In the United States, we're kind of midway, where we have stabilized emissions more or less for the last 5 years. That's good. What we really need them to do is begin to go down. Leveling is not enough because they're already high. And so the United States has enacted virtually no climate change policy or energy policy. Even the ones that Obama tried to enact are being clawed back by the administration, and that is not a fan of climate science, is not a fan of the reality of what we need to do to get to protect ourselves. So that's what's going down in DC right now. Very unfortunate.
All right. Well, we are down to about the last 2 minutes of class. Can we give Dr. Cobb a round of applause for her time?
Thank you guys for hearing me out.
We appreciate it. You see her Twitter handle there on your handout, so if you are a Twitter user, you can follow her. She's got a blue check mark, just in case you've seen that. We did have a couple of questions from students that did not get answered today. Would you be willing to answer those over email for us?
Sure.
Okay, awesome.
And that goes for anybody else too.
So I will, we will recap. I know a lot of you didn't hear necessarily all the questions. I'll recap and we'll go back over anything that was confusing next class period. Yeah, so one of the questions that students had was about the red meat versus other meat from your video. And then also about single-use plastics. Like if you see those at all in your studies while you're in the ocean, and about the impacts of those.
Yes.
So those were the two questions we did not have time for today.
Okay, all right. I will answer those on email.
Okay, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciated it.
So fun. Thanks a
Thank you.
lot. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ah.